May 1940, Western Europe erupted into one of the most decisive armoured clashes in history. German Panzer divisions surged westward, colliding head-on with French and British tank units in battles that were fast, chaotic and brutally unforgiving. On paper, the Allies held the advantage. Many French tanks were better armoured, better armed, and in some aspects outright superior to their German counterparts. But wars aren't won on paper. Superior coordination, aggressive massed tank tactics, and decisive leadership allowed the Germans to outmaneuver and overwhelm their opponents. After less than 2 months of fighting, the once formidable French army collapsed. Retreats turned chaotic, supply lines broke down, and hundreds of tanks were abandoned, often fully intact, after running out of fuel or suffering minor mechanical failures. When the dust settled, Germany had captured nearly 3,500 French tanks. Among this unexpected windfall were roughly 250 to 300 Somua S35 cavalry tanks, widely regarded as some of the best tanks in the French arsenal at that time. With German tank production still limited, these captured machines, called Panzer, were too valuable to ignore, and the Somua S35 would soon find itself fighting under an entirely different flag. Following their victory, the Germans established collection and evaluation centres where captured French vehicles and weapons were gathered and assessed for their military value. Most of these would remain stationed in occupied France to simplify logistics. The captured tanks were regarded as a significant asset to the German army. However, despite the large numbers seized, they could not be put into service immediately. Nearly all required extensive overhauls before becoming operational, a time-consuming process further complicated by shortages of spare parts and by the need to persuade the defeated French to cooperate. Interestingly, despite Germany's extensive use of captured vehicles from various countries throughout the war, French armoured vehicles were the only ones for which the Germans seized entire production facilities. By German standards, vehicles from occupied Czechoslovakia were not classified as Panzers because they had actually been paid for. Among the captured vehicles, the German army paid particular attention to the French Somua S35. Developed in the mid-1930s, it was one of the most modern tanks in French service and was designed specifically for the fast, mechanized formations of the French cavalry. Officially designated as the Char du Cavalerie 1935S, it featured frontal armour approximately 45mm thick, was armed with a powerful 47mm main gun, and could reach speeds approaching 40 km an hour. These characteristics made it a formidable opponent, one that German forces often found difficult to counter. The S-35 was largely immune to standard 3.7cm German anti-tank weapons, except at very close range. Nevertheless, the tank also suffered from notable shortcomings, including bad crew ergonomics, poor visibility and low production numbers, with only around 400 units completed by May 1940. In German service, the tank was designated Panzer Kampfwagen 35S 739F, or more simply as the Panzer 35S. The first captured vehicles were sent to the German testing facility at Kummersdorf for evaluation. Following trials, the tank was deemed suitable for service and officially approved for use within the German army. Before the captured vehicles were issued to frontline units, a number of modifications were carried out to meet German operational standards. To improve command and control, German radio equipment was installed, along with a rod antenna mount positioned on the right side of the superstructure. One of the main shortcomings identified by German evaluators was poor visibility, particularly for the commander. The original French commander's cupola provided a limited field of view, which the Germans considered inadequate. To address this issue, many tanks received a redesigned cupola fitted with a two-part hatch. However, this modification was not universal. Some vehicles retained their original French cupolas, while others were fitted with cupolas salvaged from Panzer II or Panzer III tanks. Additional modifications were more minor and inconsistently applied. These included the installation of external stowage boxes and, in some cases, the application of Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste. There were also plans to refit the Panzer 35S with the more powerful 220 horsepower S40 diesel engine, but this proposal never progressed beyond the planning stage. As the Panzer 35 tanks were gradually repaired and returned to service, they were initially stationed in France, for training purposes and occupation duties. As the restoration of these captured French vehicles was a slow and labour-intensive process, the first usable tanks did not become available until the end of 1940. Adolf Hitler had envisioned the formation of at least 4 panzer divisions equipped with French tanks, along with several independent tank regiments. However, this plan proved to be both logistically and practically unfeasible. By late 1941, when the majority of the captured tanks had finally been restored to operational condition, they were already considered obsolete in terms of firepower, armour protection and mobility, making them unsuitable for frontline service. Despite this, the Panzer 35S and other captured French tanks still found use in secondary roles, including training, security duties and the suppression of resistance activities in occupied territories. A further complication was the shortage of trained and experienced personnel. The most capable crews had already been assigned to fully equipped panzer divisions, leaving only a small pool of qualified individuals to operate the refurbished tanks. As a result, these vehicles were primarily manned by volunteers, many of whom had prior experience operating tanks, though not necessarily to a high standard. Even after the basic training, the crews lacked the expertise needed for coordinated, large-scale operations. Consequently, deploying captured French tanks in full divisional formations was deemed impractical. Instead, they were distributed in small groups to support infantry units, where their limitations in offensive capability would be less detrimental. Since the Panzer 35S was originally a French tank, it is not surprising that the first German units to operate them were formed in France. This was primarily for logistical reasons. Spare parts and maintenance facilities were readily available there. These units were mostly used to patrol occupied France and to serve as training formations for newly created or reorganized units. Despite Hitler's initial plans to outfit entire divisions with captured French tanks, the first actual units were relatively small. One of the earliest was the 100th Panzer Brigade, established in March 1941. It was primarily equipped with Panzer 35S and Hotchkiss tanks. By January 1943, the brigade had expanded to regimental strength and was operating around 145 French tanks of various types, including approximately 15 Panzer 35S. In mid-July 1943, the regiment was integrated into the 21st Panzer Division, which was stationed in France. At that point, the number of Panzer 35S tanks had grown to 54. In May 1944, the unit was redesignated as the 22nd Panzer Regiment. By the time of the Allied landings in Normandy in July 1944, the regiment had largely been re-equipped with modern Panzer IV tanks. However, it still retained one battalion, mainly used for training purposes, which was outfitted with around 23 to 35 Panzer 35S tanks and several older Panzer IVs with short-barrel guns. This battalion, like much of the regiment, would lose nearly all its vehicles in combat against the Allies later that year. Another example is the 206th Panzer Battalion, formed in late 1941. Its primary duties were training and occupational tasks. During the Allied landings in Normandy in 1944, it was stationed on the Cotentin Peninsula, where it eventually lost almost all its vehicles. This was the general fate of most German units equipped with the Panzer 35S. Nevertheless, a few of these tanks did manage to retreat back to Germany. The 224th Panzer Company had a single Panzer 35S. This unit took part in the fighting around the Arnhem Bridge. By the end of 1944, a lone Panzer 35S from this unit was still operational. Another tank survived in the Panzer Company Bergen, where it was still recorded as operational as late as 1st of February 1945. Some Panzer 35S tanks were deployed to the Northern Theatre of War, with several stationed in Norway for occupation duties. The Panzer 35S later also saw combat during German operations aimed at cutting off critical Soviet supply lines to the port of Murmansk. Assigned to the 211th Tank Battalion, these tanks operated in rugged, mountainous terrain that was poorly suited to armoured warfare. As a result, they were typically employed in small numbers to provide direct support for infantry units, rather than being used in large armoured formations. Despite their limited deployment, the Panzer 35S units were heavily engaged in combat with Soviet forces. Between the 1st and 8th of July 1941, German reports recorded the loss of 6 tanks, 4 of which were damaged beyond repair and written off. An additional 10 tanks suffered mechanical breakdowns during this period, but were later repaired and returned to service. In return, the unit claimed the destruction of 24 enemy tanks and 5 anti-tank guns. By May 1943, both units were still operating Panzer 35S tanks in this region. 17 vehicles were still stationed in Norway, 15 of them assigned to the 25th Panzer Division. In Finland, the 211th Tank Battalion operated a further 16 Panzer 35S tanks. By June 1944, continued attrition and obsolescence had reduced the total number still in service to just 13 vehicles. On the Eastern Front outside of the northern regions, the Panzer 35S was a rare sight. One of the few known units to operate the type was the 223rd Tank Company, formed in February 1942. This small unit was equipped with 5 Panzer 35S tanks, all of which were lost by the end of the same year. By the end of May 1943, only 2 Panzer 35S tanks were still listed as operational on the Eastern Front. Several vehicles were ultimately captured by Soviet forces, with one surviving example preserved today at the Patriot Park. Following the rapid collapse of Yugoslavia during the so-called April War of 1941, the Axis powers imposed a harsh occupation regime across the country. In response, 2 major resistance movements emerged, both of which would go on to inflict significant losses on the occupying forces in terms of manpower and equipment. As partisan activity intensified and expanded, German forces were increasingly compelled to deploy armoured units to support counter-insurgency operations, including formations equipped with Panzer 35S tanks. One such unit was the 202nd Tank Battalion, which was deployed to Yugoslavia in September 1941. The battalion was equipped primarily with captured French vehicles, including around 20 Panzer 35S tanks and more than 40 Hotchkiss tanks. Within the unit, the Panzer 35S typically served as the command tank at the platoon level. German armoured forces in Yugoslavia were generally employed in small, dispersed detachments, providing mobile fire support to infantry units spread over wide areas. At this stage of the war, these armoured elements proved relatively effective, as partisan forces initially lacked both sufficient anti-tank weapons and experience in engaging armoured vehicles. By early April 1944, the 202nd Tank Battalion still retained 8 Panzer 35S tanks in service. By this time, however, the vehicles were increasingly worn and mechanically unreliable, and plans were made to replace them later that year with captured Italian tanks. One of the final recorded engagements involving the Panzer 35S in Yugoslavia took place on 3rd of May 1945. During a clash between German and partisan forces, the now well-trained partisans succeeded in destroying 7 German tanks using anti-tank guns, marking one of the last documented uses of the aging Panzer 35S in the Balkan theatre. While the Panzer 35S was a capable and effective tank in 1940, its combat value steadily declined as armoured vehicle development progressed throughout the war. As was typical German practice, aging Panzer 35S tanks were not simply discarded, but instead repurposed for a variety of secondary yet still important roles. One such role was that of the Fachel Panzer 35S, used primarily for driver training. In several cases, these vehicles were heavily modified, with the armoured superstructure and turret removed entirely to simplify maintenance and improve visibility for instruction. A very limited number of tanks were converted into Panzerbefehlswagen 35S command vehicles, outfitted with additional radio equipment. These can be easily identified by the large fixed-frame antenna mounted over the engine compartment. To make space for the extra radio systems within the already cramped interior, the main gun and ammunition storage were removed and replaced with a wooden mock-up of the gun. approximately 60 vehicles were modified to serve as Panzer Zugmittel 35S, essentially artillery towing tractors for heavy equipment and guns. In many cases, the turret was removed to reduce weight. Around 15 Panzer 35S units were also mounted on rail cars to serve as improvised armoured trains. These saw action primarily in the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. Lastly, a number of Panzer 35S turrets were reused as static defensive emplacements in France. Faced with persistent tank shortages and increasing requests for military aid from its numerous allies, Germany increasingly relied on the redistribution of captured French armoured vehicles, including the Panzer 35S. In 1943, Bulgaria, which had hoped to receive modern German-built tanks, was instead supplied with several Panzer 35S vehicles. In the same year, Croatia, another German-aligned state, received a number of French 47mm tank turrets intended for installation on armoured trains. Italy also received a contingent of 32 Panzer 35S tanks, though these vehicles saw little to no combat use during their service. The last German ally to be supplied with the type was Hungary, which deployed 2 Panzer 35S tanks with small independent armoured detachments engaged in anti-partisan operations on the Eastern Front. Both vehicles were lost by 1944. Following the Allied landings in Normandy, elements of the French resistance managed to recapture several Panzer 35S tanks and turned them against German occupation forces. These reclaimed vehicles remained in service until 1946, after which they were finally withdrawn. In Yugoslavia, communist partisans also occasionally captured Panzer 35S tanks. In one particularly inventive example, a captured vehicle was refitted with a salvaged 57mm gun taken from a damaged AEC Mark II armoured car. This improvised tank appears to have been lost in its first engagement, and its ultimate fate remains unknown. This concludes our video on the Somua S35 in German service. What are your thoughts on this vehicle? Do you think it was one of the more effective tanks captured and used by the Germans during the war? And would you like to see more videos covering captured or repurposed armoured vehicles in the future? Let us know your opinions in the comments section below. As always, if you'd like to subscribe, we invite you to do so to stay updated on future content. If you'd like to support the channel further, consider contributing via Patreon or PayPal. We'd like to give a special thanks to our medium and heavy tank tier Patreon supporters: Dave Shuford, Sopwith21, Dan Fitzpatrick, Owen M, and R. Rob. Your generous contributions help fund our research, illustrations, and video production. Until next time, keep us in your sights.